There are moments when a lifetime of careful restraint, of work done in rooms where no one kept minutes, collects into a single act of visibility. Lily Lamont had learned to hold her face steady while the world rearranged around her. She had learned to speak with the economy of steel, clear, exact, unadorned. She believed in building things that lasted, towers, policies, reputations earned by proof. But all the while, someone else had been narrating her labor into somebody else's legend. This is the story of what she chose to do when that ledger was finally opened. If you're watching this on the channel, please stay until the end. There's a moment you won't want to miss. Like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the rest of this story. May dignity find the small, the brave, and the overlooked. May what has been hidden be given a careful, unflinching light. Lily signed with the understated motion of someone who had learned the choreography of major deals. The conference room in the Marina Bay Tower was all cool glass and engineered light. Outside, the city glowed in humid bands, a ribbon of traffic and neon that made the sea smudge into the horizon. Dominic Ashford sat to her right, his hands folded around a pen as if it were a compass. His calm made a frame for the executive faces across the table, investors who spoke in precise capitals, lawyers whose smiles were practiced for presentations. The contract on the table had the kind of number most people only saw in headlines: $400 million. For Lamont Ashford, it was a hinge. They had been building toward it for years. Under Lily's direction, the firm had rewritten the blueprints of urban equity, community spaces inserted into towers, guaranteed attribution clauses for design teams, mandatory mentorship funds for women-led contractors. The Lamont Ashford Tower would be the first project to require public audit of credit on every major subcontract. It would also fund scholarships for women engineers from the neighborhoods those towers displaced. To Lily, those clauses were not window dressing. They were the structural reproofs she had drawn against a past that had made her invisible. When the ink dried, Dominic stood and did the small ritual of clasping Lily's shoulder. No flourish, no ownership, merely a warm, steady pressure that said, "We did this." Outside, someone opened a bottle of champagne. The celebration that followed was soft and professional. The team posed for photos, flashes that caught the steel of the tower beyond and threw back bright, sharp light. For a moment, standing among the people who had stayed with the work from the first battered plan, Lily felt the old, slow wash of gratitude. It was not the same as relief. Gratitude sat beside the ache, like a well-planted tree in a field that had once been scorched. She closed her eyes for half a breath and remembered a hospital corridor, the smell of antiseptic and lemon oil. The air there had the green smell of cut grass and the faint, old-money fragrance of cognac and roses. Guests gathered in small clusters, laughter rehearsed, champagne flutes clinking like tiny ceremonial bells. Camera crews hovered politely. This wedding would make a certain kind of weekend piece. Lily arrived alone, in a dress that read perfectly, that is, it did not scream for attention. She had learned to dress like a protocol brief, neat, decisive, without drama. It kept people from asking unnecessary questions. Her entrance was the kind that produced polite recognition, nods, the discreet exchange of names, the measured smile that meant, "I have noted you and will not be distracted." She found a seat near the back of the tent, which gave her a vantage point like a blueprint view of the proceedings. People who did not know their history saw only the surface arrangements. Johnson, impeccably suited, laughing with a woman whose name, Gabrielle, slipped like silk into the air. He moved through the crowd like a conductor, cues marked by the tilt of a head. There were whispered toasts about new beginnings, about family, about hard-won second chances. The language sat oddly to her ear. It was the same rhetoric that had been used the night her own marriage started to hollow, the same language that had been used to paper over other people's grief into palatable anecdotes. As the ceremony eased into a reception, photographs multiplied into an inventory of curated joy. Couples grouping, children running along the fringe, grandparents collapsing like careful punctuation into chairs. The reception's acoustics softened the lines between private and public. A voice at the microphone could change the valence of the room in a few sentences. Johnson, buoyed by amiable speeches, rose to give one himself. He was the sort of man who used a toast to perform an entire narrative of himself. His failures minimized, his successes clarified, his generosity emphasized. Tonight, his speech would be a sculpting of his brand. Lily had no intention of interrupting the ceremony. Her plan was simpler and harder: to be there as witness, to make herself known to anyone who needed to see that the story had a missing line. But words have weight, and Johnson's had always been heavier than the truth. When he reached for the nadir of anecdote, she felt the old containment crack. He spoke of difficult seasons and grace, of lessons learned, and of a woman who supported him. Careful grammar that flattened the shape of the past into a gentle arc of redemption where culpability could be softened into growing pains. The room filled with polite applause. Lily felt her breath as if it were a live instrument between her ribs. The dignity she had cultivated sat like an armor. She rose quietly, the act understated, the way one might stand to consult a displaced map. People looked, a few eyebrows rose. The social question: who stands at a wedding when the bride and groom are speaking? The music slowed. She moved through the tent as if moving through a series of measured steps in a legal argument. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud. It was precisely audible, a tone that commanded attention without theatrics. "Johnson," she said, and the name landed like an invoice. "We both know what work looks like. We both know what it costs." He blinked. His smile, practiced and quick, faltered into a momentary human tilt, an expression that would later be dissected on opinion panels. Gabrielle reached for his hand, a gesture of alliance that was sharp in its own right. Lily did not wait for permission. She had brought evidence, not for spectacle, but to correct the public ledger. She took from her clutch a slim tablet. Today, a ledger could be a screen. And with a calmness that made the room watch, she tapped to display a string of emails. She read excerpts aloud, not to humiliate, but to illumine. Contracts where her input appeared only in tracked comments. Design schematics bearing her annotations that had been filed under other names. Messages where Johnson thanked her privately and took the credit publicly. Her words mapped a pattern rather than a scandal. There was a sound like a collective intake of breath. Some guests looked away, others leaned in, as if to catch the end of a sentence in a case study. Dominic, who had had little reason to attend, watched from the margin like a guardian in tailored confusion. The tabloids would later call the moment the unmasking, and they would misread its subtleties. Here, it landed most heavily on two people, Johnson and Gabrielle. Gabrielle's face tightened. Grief, then the composure of someone newly installed into the role of Concour's judge. She rose, her own social training meeting Lily's accusation with a steady grace. "This is not the place for a private audit," she said, voice cool, the kind of sentence designed to restore decorum. Lily's answer was a fact. "It is the place history is being told," she said. "You were told, all of you, that you were celebrating one story. I am asking you to consider the other." Her voice did not tremble. She did not shout. The tent felt suddenly too small for the complexities it had been asked to hold. Johnson opened his mouth, the old reflex moving toward containment. He had been praised in public because he had mastered the art of controlling narratives. His first reaction was the practiced deflection of someone who had long lived in compliment. "We're celebrating love tonight," he said. "This is inappropriate." There was an oldness in his tone that had once been companionable to her, the voice that had once reassured her. But the harder truth was that his pattern of gaslighting did not die because he was better at public apology. The room watched the incision of history being made. For a moment, silence extended as an obligation. Then, because bodies in rooms seldom remain statues for long, a guest began to murmur, and uncertain sound that rolled into others. Some people turned off sympathy into the quiet of private judgments. Others, the ones who had seen the seams of their own lives stitched too tight by others, met Lily's eyes with something like relief. Johnson moved toward her, the man whose past claims over her work had been small, steady thefts. He was not violent. His hands trembled with the quick panic of a man startled into accountability. "Lily," he started. She looked at him full. She did not wish him harm. She had never wanted spectacle as an end. She wanted recognition. The demand was simple and righteous. "You never learned to say the name," she said. "You preferred to narrate the chorus and leave the verses unnamed." The room noted the intimacy of that accusation. People who had only ever seen polished edges smelled something like truth. Johnson's face moved through a series of expressions: anger, the hint of shame, then the shudder of denial. Gabrielle's hand tightened on his sleeve, and her eyes flicked quickly from him to Lily and read, with a speed that sometimes passes for seeing, the long architecture of their past. "You have no right to," he began, a lawyerly cadence rising. "You are forgetting the work that built your stage," Lily cut in. "You are forgetting the person who built the script." A slap might have been expected by some. Dramatic storytelling prefers physicality as punctuation, but Lily's method was different. She had learned to weaponize clarity rather than violence. She had evidence, a moral patent. The reaction that followed was the sort that would tilt careers. Johnson's smile cracked and fell. The podium of his public persona tilted. Someone in the crowd whispered that this was career-ending. A few camera phones recorded. Gabrielle's face, elegant and taut, shifted to a tight incredulity. For Johnson, the humiliation was immediate and compound. He had always been practiced in repair. He smiled through scandal, bought statements, donated to causes. But the visual of his ex-wife stating in a wedding tent that his public narrative had been partially based on her own silent labor was a form of exposure less easily managed by charity. He had built a brand on being the man who made things happen. When the ledger of who had actually made things happen was set down in front of him, it cut into the currency he trafficked in. The evening dissolved into aftershocks. Some guests retreated as if to secure their own reputations. Others clustered on the edges and whispered. Dominic came up quietly to Lily and offered his arm. "Shall we go?" he asked, the question luminous in its simplicity. He did not try to take the moment from her. He merely offered his steadiness. She allowed him to guide her toward the fringe. Cameras swiveled, but the narrative had already begun to ossify into pieces. Columns, think pieces, social media threads. In the days ahead, pundits would argue intent and method, but what had happened in that tent was not the end of the story. It was instead the lever that lifted a heavy plate. Johnson's immediate response was legal counsels and PR statements, measured and crafted to reclaim the evening's image. He issued an apology that nodded toward oversights and miscommunications, the classic verbs of deflection. Gabrielle withdrew to consult friends. Her public face remained carefully composed. Some in the industry called Lily reckless, accused her of staging a scene. Others, a quieter majority who had felt the pressure of being uncredited, called it overdue. The next week was a blur of articles and urgent conference calls. Investors rang Dominic and Lily with questions that were mostly tactical. There were also private messages from people they had mentored. "We saw you," one said, and sent a list of names, young engineers whose careers now found evidence in the public ledger. Those messages were not consolations so much as verification. A network snapped into being, visible at last. Johnson's response, when it deepened beyond PR, took the shape of lawyers' letters and then unexpected, halting gestures. He filed for an injunction, less to silence Lily than to stall the narrative, to give him time to recompose. To the world, that looked like a man desperate to stop a leak. To Lily, it looked like the familiar reflex of someone trying to preserve a brand by legal means rather than moral reckoning. On a rain-washed morning, an article emerged that would complicate everything. Metadata unearthed by a junior journalist showed tracked changes on a project file, timestamps, IP addresses, comments in Lily's voice. The paper printed them as if releasing a court exhibit. For the first time in a long while, the facts began to line up in a way that could be read without the usual erasures. When the firm's legal team prepared to push back, they did so not as prosecutors, but as preservers of truth. Each clause of the Lamont-Ashford policy now doubling as a shield for those who had been erased. Johnson, who had never been subjected to a sustained public unraveling before, began to spin into a narrower life. Fewer board invitations, fewer late-night hosts calling. Where there had been easy access, now there were closed offices and lawyers' hands between him and his previous rhythm. He did not collapse theatrically. Instead, he moved into a quieter panic. Phone calls to old friends that found polite, cold air on the other end. This was the kind of defeat he had not rehearsed for. It required a humility he did not possess by habit. For Lily, the victory of those days was not the immediate impact on Johnson, she had not sought vengeance, but the shift in a market that had normalized invisibility. Dominic and she began to be asked to speak at forums. Their rhetoric was never triumphalist. It was sober. Credit as structural requirement, not as charity. Young women reached out with resumes and war stories. Lily's inbox filled with names she had ached to see visible. It felt iatrogenically like, but consequences pull a string elsewhere. Johnson, pushed into a corner, made a move that would change the legal landscape between them. Late one night, his counsel sent a notice. He would file suit alleging reputational damage and defamation. It was a move born of panic and of someone who believed that law could be used as a curtain. The firm braced. Dominic's jaw tightened in a way Lily had come to know as strategy-caliber focus. They had the emails, the track changes, the contracts with her name in the metadata. Evidence, in those hours, felt both fragile and inexorable. It would be weeks before the courtroom lights and column inches forced a moral reckoning. There would be hearings and exhibits, motions and discovery. Johnson's legal gambit had an intended effect. It turned a public moral argument into a formal conflict, a mechanism that would, by its very nature, require documentation. For a woman whose life had often been recorded only in the margins, that fact was a hard gift. When the summons arrived, Lily held it with a steadiness cultivated through the years of medical scans and strategic planning. The legal calendar was another map to be read. Dominic slid a folder toward her, the initial depositions, timelines, forensic work on metadata. He did not speak of triumph. They both understood defamation suits were traps that could entangle truth and hem it with procedure. Lily read the documents as if they were blueprints. Each highlighted line was an axis to hold, a place to anchor witness testimony, and the names of those who would finally be called to the stand. In the press, the story frayed into predictable patterns. He said, she said, caught between the flavor of scandal and the emerging structural critique about attribution. Some outlets tried to flatten it into voyeurism. Others took the evidence seriously. For Lily, the legal process was not theater. It was heavy, disciplined work that demanded a vocabulary she had taught herself. Chain of custody, metadata integrity, witness deposition strategy. She bore its weight with the quiet ferocity of someone used to constructing things from raw components. The wedding tent had been only a hinge. The deeper unrest had always been in the small acts. A comment in a meeting that was later repeated at an awards gala. A photograph caption that gave a different byline. The law could force those small acts into the light. But legal truth is not the same as moral repair. The hearings would not undo private betrayals or the months of quiet medical fear she had carried alone. They would, however, make the ledger public. Johnson's response to being cornered was not immediate contrition. Instead, behind closed doors, he began to see, slowly, painfully, the accumulation of his own self-myth. He began, at the urging of friends who had seen him in some prior life, to attend therapy. It was not a pleasant discovery for him. Making the admission that one had benefited from another's labor without acknowledgement is rude, slow labor of conscience. But humility, when it arrives, tends to come through hard work and repeated inconvenience. He attended sessions, wrote journals under the therapist's direction, and, this was recorded by acquaintances, took small, awkward steps to make restitution materials available when asked. One of the turning points in public perception was not a courtroom, but a leaked email in which Johnson thanked a junior associate, someone Lilly had personally mentored, by name, for a technical fix that saved a proposal. The name appeared where, in previous years, his signature had sufficed. For many observers, that signaled either a PR pivot or a genuine change. The difference would be tested in time. For Lilly, the work continued. She shifted between hearings and firm management, between drafting policy and responding to a new tidal map of requests for comment. She also kept an appointment with herself to sit in the quiet of the new office she had designed for Lamont Ashford. A white room with blueprints pinned like prayer flags, and a window that looked out on cranes and scaffolding. Sometimes she slept poorly. Sometimes she woke with the pulse of gratitude steady and measurable. The tower's groundbreaking date loomed. The ceremonial shoveling would be a public, physical acknowledgement of the firm's commitments. Yet even as the public scaffolding shifted, there remained private fissures neither process nor press could mend. The memory of illness, of the single shake of a hand that had once struck more than a chord. There had been a night in a construction yard years earlier when tempers flared and Johnson crossed a line, a slap that belonged in a private ledger of pain. She had not spoken of that then. That mark had been one of the many reasons she eventually sought separation. It had defined the boundaries she would not, could not let into relation. Those private histories shaped the way she engaged with justice. She wanted truth, not spectacle, repair, not revenge. The confrontation at the wedding changed things, but it did not resolve everything. It made visible what had been invisible. It opened a legal path. It also began a longer moral experiment. What happens to a man when the stories that maintained him fall away? And what must he give back to be counted redeemed? In its own scrambled way, that was the question the public insisted on answering. When the first court dates were set, Lilly prepared like an architect for a key inspection. She reviewed notes, rehearsed testimony with Dominic and their counsel, and read the names of those she wanted to bring forward. The days were a mixture of grit and dignity. The hearings promised to be where private pain met public order, where metadata would be placed against memory. On the eve of the first hearing, she found herself alone in the office with the tower plans spread out like a map of the future, and a small photograph tucked beneath the blueprints. A stolen image from a private album, a picture of her and Johnson at a time when their partnership had not yet ossified into pattern. The photograph was yellowing at the edges. Their smiles were younger, less practiced. She put the photograph aside, folded the blueprints, and left for the courthouse with Dominic at her side, their partnership no longer hidden in the margins, but intentional and public. Outside, the city exhaled in the way it had when she had signed that contract, humid, incandescent, full of scaffolding and possibility. The legal engines would turn slowly. The wedding would be talked about for weeks. But there was also the tower and the apprentices now named on public lists, and the quiet hearings where facts would be allowed to speak. Lily moved toward the work with the calm ferocity she had always carried. She did not mistake moral clarity for catharsis. There was more to build. The day of the hearing, press vans lined the street. Cameras congealed into a polished, hungry public. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled of paper and coffee. The wood was warmed by decades of precedent. Lily felt the familiar tightness that comes before any important public act. The same sense that had come before every surgery, every board meeting, every keynote. Dominic sat in the second row, hands folded, his presence a measured steadiness that made the room feel less like a hunting ground and more like a tribunal for evidence. Johnson entered with his counsel, a man whose handshake had become part of Johnson's personality of control. He looked thinner in the way time thins those who must constantly arrange public statements. When their eyes met across the room, it was like two veterans marking one another's wounds. Neither looked away. The hearing began. Evidence was called, witnesses sworn, timelines read aloud with the flat, relentless cadence of law. It would be the careful footwork in the months after, depositions revealing pattern, a whistleblower cooperation agreement whispered about by pundits, Johnson's eventual decision to provide documents that implicated others. That would decide the arc of his fall and the breadth of his reparation. But on that first day, the battle was slow and small. A list of timestamps, a designer's testimony about being credited only in footnotes, a contract where a clause had been altered in one draft to remove attribution, the line about who gets named. Each line read aloud sounded like renovating a lie. Outside, the wedding photos still made their rounds in social media feeds and lifestyle sections. In private chats, people parsed motives. For Lily, who had once kept her cancer private to avoid pity and preserve professional dignity, the court was yet another place where she had to be seen clearly and judged fairly. She walked it like someone who had trained for endurance, not furious, but insistently present. The case would not be decided in a single hearing. It would require months of discovery and, eventually, a moral reckoning that extended beyond legal verdicts into industry practices. Johnson's choices ahead, whether to fully account for his thefts, whether to use his access to unmake the structures that had let him profit, would shape whether he was forgiven as a man who had repented or simply as one who had been shrunken by consequence. For now, the world watched. And Lily, standing somewhat at the center of it, kept her face steady and measured. She was not the kind of heroine raised on catharsis. She was an engineer of systems, a woman who insisted that structures carry accountability. She had chosen visibility not as performance, but as method. The confrontation at the wedding had been a necessary moment of unmasking. What followed would be the longer work of translation. Law into justice, exposure into reform, grief into policy. When the court adjourned for the day, Lily walked out into a low, gilded light. Dominic offered an umbrella against the threat of rain, and the two of them stepped into the city that had been the setting for both her erasure and now her vindication. As they moved down the stairs, a young woman paused them and said quietly, "Thank you. You made a space for our names." Lily's reply was a small, dignified nod. She had no illusions about single-handed change, but she had always believed in structural amendments that lasted longer than impulse. In the weeks that followed, as legal teams traded briefs and the press ran with narratives, the Lamont Ashford Tower broke ground on schedule. The ceremony was modest and purposeful, no champagne cascades, but a laying of first stones with names attached. Apprentices in hard hats with their supervisors beside them. Lily took one of the ceremonial shovels and in the dirt felt an old, practical joy. This was work to be counted. Even with the construction site's dust in her nails, the memory of the wedding tent lingered as the point where private ledger met public accounting. People would remember the image, Lily standing in the tent, her tablet held steady like a small altar. For Lily, the memory would function less as triumph than as pivot, an inciting event that made legal remedy possible and opened a path toward the structural remedies she had long drafted. Johnson, for his part, would begin the slow, halting work of reformation, therapy, restitution gestures, and then, most consequentially, the choice to cooperate as a whistleblower.
That act would cost him reputation and, materially, access. But it would also be the kind of restorative cost the DNA of justice often demands. Not a theatrical fall, but a procedural surrender meant to repair broad systems. Dominic would stand with Lily as partner, both personal and professional. Their partnership would be marked by equal crediting and shared public presence, a model complicating the old scripts of mentorship that too easily became ownership. Their relationship was not an erasure of past hurts. It was a deliberate architecture, boundaries, equitable compensation, and shared labor made visible. For now, the chapters of the legal fight were just beginning. The wedding.
Confrontation had shifted the axis, but the work of rebuilding trust and structural fairness would play out in depositions and boardrooms, in policy memos and award ceremonies. Lily stepped into those days with the same composed ferocity that had guided her through illness and through the quiet theft of her labor. She had chosen visibility as a method and as a moral imperative. The world, at long last, had to read her name. Discovery unfolded like a long, precise unearthing. Files that had once lived as inert clouds or buried folders were coaxed into daylight by teams of forensic accountants and software auditors. Timestamps were argued over like fragments of testimony. Depositions stretched across days and then weeks. Lily moved through them with the same disciplined calm she applied to blueprints. Align facts, isolate variables, mark the assumptions. When counsel asked her to explain, she spoke in declarative sentences. She refused theatricality. She would not let emotion be mistaken for error. The most consequential hearings were not the ones with the camera crews in the front row. They were the meetings behind closed doors where gatekeepers decided whether to change covenants or to preserve them. There, Lily listened more than she spoke. She watched board members shuffle papers and count their exposure in micro-expressions. She cataloged the points where incentive had become distortion, where bonus formulas had encouraged concealment. Her proposals were precise. Independent audits every quarter, clear attribution protocols for intellectual property, escrowed credits for junior engineers, external oversight of contractor selection. She framed each recommendation as engineering work, modular, testable, capable of being verified. That approach helped disarm some of the defenders of the old order. Arguments couched as technical necessities could be debated on technical grounds. There was less room for the rhetorical smokescreens that had once allowed appropriation to appear benign. Still, reform met resistance. Some executives resisted any oversight that might cut margins. Others feared precedent. Lobbyists drafted letters citing innovation friction. There were leaked op-eds, thinly veiled threats about competitiveness. Each pushback was a measurement to be accounted for. Johnson's cooperation shifted the calculus. He turned over access logs, email chains, and a cache of draft contracts that made the reallocation of credit undeniable. His testimony, when it came, was halting and accompanied by the small, fracturing human details of someone unmoored from identity built around power. He described late nights spent rationalizing adjustments to documentation, the quiet arithmetic of self-justification. He spoke of guilt slowly coalescing into responsibility, and then into action, confession, restitution, the naming of colleagues and processes that had permitted his behavior. For many in the industry, his admissions were a salve. For others, they were the beginning of a wider reckoning. Regulators signaled inquiries. Universities that had accepted donations from the firm requested audits. Some philanthropic partners backtracked from programs connected to the implicated designs. A few board members resigned quietly. One did so with a valedictory line about accountability and the future. The legal fight would still take months to resolve, but the momentum toward institutional change had acquired a force of its own. Lily's work extended beyond the legal text. She drafted a model policy, then refined it through consultation with junior engineers and labor lawyers. She insisted that the model include enforceable mechanisms for attribution, plain, auditable trails that could not be reworked into invisibility. Dominic, whose background combined design practice with a capacity for negotiation, helped translate Lily's technical language into the lexicon of governance. Together, they held roundtables with apprentices and senior managers, insisting that reforms protect those most likely to be sidelined. At home, the days were not without strain. There were mornings when Lily woke before dawn with a knot of fatigue that no amount of coffee smoothed. She would lay her hand on the scarred furrow where chemotherapy had once thinned her hair and feel the quiet continuity of a body that had endured. Dominic learned to read the small signs: a hand that lingered too long on a file folder, a delayed response to a text, the way she sometimes needed 40 minutes of solitude after a hearing to recompose. He respected those needs with a fidelity that mirrored their professional accord. He did not rescue her, he rearranged the team so she could rest when she needed it. They set patterns: dinners with no devices, weekends for low-energy walks, a ritual exchange of the day's single hardest fact over a cup of tea. There were tender, unshowy moments that did not make the press. In the scaffolding clatter of the Lamont Ashford site, an apprentice named Marisol scraped dirt from under her nails and laughed when Lily compared the gesture to old habits of the field, engineers who had kept their hands honest. Marisol's apprenticeship was one of the visible shifts Lily and Dominic had fought for: an explicit mentorship contract, paid and credited, with deliverables and public recognition. That contract would later be cited in board meetings as a model for equitable practice. The young woman who had stopped Lily on the courthouse steps came by the site one afternoon with 2 colleagues and stayed, learning to read plans in the shade of a crane. Seeing them, Lily felt the steady gravity of cause. The work she had chosen was making possible the names she could no longer assume would remain invisible. Still, not every moment yielded satisfaction. A conservative faction on a rival firm began a quiet campaign to discredit the reforms as performative. They published analyses that picked at the fine print, arguing that external audits were a bureaucratic burden that stifled initiative. Trade journals ran columns that framed Lily's proposals as a potential drag on profitability. On her screen, commentary threads looped between praise and animus. She learned to let most of it pass beside her like wind on glass. The moment of real consequence was the one where policy changed practice. That moment arrived slowly, in increments. A city planning commission adopted a clause requiring transparent contractual chains for public projects. A national engineering society issued new standards for attribution and collaborative credit. Funders began including equitable credits provisions in grant agreements. Each adoption was a small pivot. Together, they shifted the contours of what professional success looked like. The rewards were not always monetary. Lily found that her influence had altered the culture of meetings so that more junior voices were now routinely called on for clarifications during technical reviews. Her name appeared on panels and at conferences. But the satisfaction came instead from the quiet multiplication of visible careers. There were awards, too, hushed ceremonies where the work of many was acknowledged with a plaque or a brief speech. Lily accepted such honors in the mode she preferred: brief, precise, and with explicit acknowledgement of the team. She never allowed her presence to become a monologue about individual triumph. "This is not my story," she would say, listing names: apprentices, colleagues, the lawyers who never took a victory lap, the relatives who had sent meals in small, unprinted envelopes. The audiences, when they listened, sometimes rose to their feet. Johnson's path forward continued to be mixed. Restitution negotiations took months. He liquidated some assets, paid into funds providing training and scholarships for displaced junior engineers, and entered programs aimed at rebuilding trust. The public judged him variably. Some accepted his contrition and saw in it the possibility of repair. Others suspected a performative calculus. Lily did not control public sentiment. She could, however, insist that his cooperation be used to reveal systems and not just to scapegoat individuals. That insistence sometimes put her at logistical odds with those who wanted quick narratives of villainy and redemption. She preferred the slower labor of reform. In the courtroom where depositions had once been parsed, a major hearing convened in late autumn to assess the civil claims against the firm and to set terms for the industry-wide reforms. The room hummed with the low energy of formal proceedings that nonetheless carried the weight of precedent. Journalists lined the galleries. Partners from multiple firms filed in with neatly folded briefs. When Lily took the stand, the chamber narrowed for her. She spoke with her characteristic clarity, mapping process flows and documenting the points at which attribution had been displaced. She brought with her demonstrable proof: code repositories, email threads, time-stamped versions of plans that made the pattern of appropriation impossible to deny. Cross-examination came from counsel, representing a cohort of defendants who argued that where policies were ambiguous, responsibility diffused. The questioners tried to make the environment appear as a fog, in which many actors had acted within an accepted culture. Lily did not let fog remain. She named the precise passings of authorship, the edits that had changed a nameplate into a footnote, the template modifications that subtly removed junior designers from credit lines. Her testimony was procedural and personal in the way of someone for whom the procedural was the armor of the personal. Outside the chambers, a small coalition of engineers organized to demand legislative safeguards for attribution. They drafted bills, lobbied committee members, and cultivated sympathetic staffers who could shepherd the language into hearings. Dominic worked quietly behind the scenes, coordinating with lobbyists whose principles aligned more than their past associations did. There was, inevitably, political negotiation. Language softened here to gain entry there, provisions staggered into implementation timelines to appease practical concerns. Lily weighed each concession against its likely capacity to protect the vulnerable. She refused salami slicing of justice into forgettable crumbs. The Lamont Ashford Tower rose on its schedule. Its steel framed the skyline with a clean, geometric certainty that made onlookers squint. When the names of contributors were etched into a commemorative plaque in the lobby, they were not merely cursive signatures, they were an engine of memory. Lily's name sat among many, not as solitary triumph, but as part of a ledger of labor. The ribbon-cutting was low-key, a gathering of people who had passed through the latterly public phases of a bitter fight and emerged with some architecture of solution. A minister offered a few words about stewardship, not prosperity, not victory, stewardship. The crowd applauded, and Lily felt the applause not as absolution, but as a token accounting. Even as the public turns quieted, the afterwork of reform demanded sustained attention. Audits revealed corners where the new measures were being gamed. One subcontractor attempted to reassign credit through an opaque clause in a supplemental agreement. Lily and Dominic caught it in a quarterly review and forced renegotiation. Each small victory reaffirmed the necessity of ongoing vigilance. Policies had to be living documents, subject to the same iteration and testing as any engineering design. There were private reckonings as well. Some colleagues who had once been distant or ambivalent now sought proximity, offering apologies or requesting informal mentoring. Lily accepted some overtures and declined others. She understood late apologies as signals that could be genuine, and, conversely, as gestures meant to re-enter social economies. She did not close the door on repair. She insisted that repair carry concrete terms. Those who wanted re-entry had to demonstrate behavioral change, openly and repeatedly, not merely produce a speech. At a smaller scale, the firm established a new position, Director of Attribution and Ethics, a role that combined auditing with mentorship, policy enforcement with professional development. Lily declined the post despite the pleas of several allies. She preferred to help define the role and to place someone who could inhabit it full-time. Her refusal was not a retreat, but a practical application of the principle she had advanced all along. Distribute responsibility so that no single persona becomes a symbolic shield for systemic work. The personal cost remained palpable. Even successes required reprioritization. Lily missed the simple activities that had once been steadying, long technical dives without the surrounding noise, evenings of quiet reading, the unhurried ease of friendship that was not measured against project milestones. She also noticed a different wear in Dominic. Sometimes his firm jaw would loosen into quiet fatigue, or he'd return from a negotiation with a small, tight crease between his brows. They learned to accept fatigue as part of the work rather than a sign of collapse. One late evening, after a particularly grueling settlement meeting that yielded a framework for restitution funds and an expanded whistleblower policy, Lily and Dominic walked the nearly empty site. Floodlights made columns of dust visible in the air. Cranes were black silhouettes against a pale moon. They spoke about small things: the scaffolding that still smelled of new steel, the apprentice who had learned to thread complex diagrams by hand when software failed. Their conversation was domestic in the way of two people who had shared a long public struggle. Mundane details alternated with the larger gratitudes. They spoke of reparations not as ceremonial payoff, but as the labor of reweaving trust. At times, the past intruded in single images: the wedding tent, a tablet held like altar, the hush when Johnson first admitted his transgressions. But those images no longer functioned as singular proof of triumph or betrayal. They occupied their place in a much larger ledger, of policy, of livelihoods altered, of careers protected. Lily maintained that ledger with methodical care. As winter congealed into a farther-on spring, the industry's conversation had shifted. Where earlier it had been dominated by conjecture and spectacle, it now included technical debate about governance. Universities rewrote syllabi to include attribution ethics. Firms rewired their MOs to require explicit credit milestones. Apprentices formed networks to support one another and to share red flags about practices that skirted the new rules. The cultural change was neither complete nor irreversible, but it had begun to alter the default. Yet some chapters of the story were still open. Legal settlements had laid the groundwork for restitution and for structural changes, but the enforceability of those structures would depend on continued oversight. There were seeds of new coalitions, some formed in mutual interest, others in opposition, that would test the durability of the reforms. Lily accepted that the work would outlast her involvement. Such was, she believed, the nature of durable change. On an ordinary Thursday morning, as the sun struck the glass of the Lamont Ashford Tower in a way that made its new facade glow like a ledger of light, Lily arrived at her office with a stack of memos. She sat at her desk, coffee cooling in the cup beside a small engraved token Marisol had given her, a flattened piece of steel stamped with the initials of apprentices who had benefited from the mentorship fund. It was a minimal object, but it held more of the story than any headline: a tangible connection between structural reform and individual lives. A new letter awaited her from a mid-sized city asking for guidance on adopting the attribution model for public projects. There were invitations to speak, to consult, to draft more documents. There were, too, quieter things that required tending: a phone call to a friend diagnosed with an illness unrelated to Lily's own, a letter from a young engineer who thanked her for making a path where none had seemed to exist. She paused before answering, feeling the steady pull of responsibility and the smaller, human need to be present. She thought of the young woman in the courthouse steps, the one who had said, "You made a space for our names." The memory of that sentence was not a hallelujah, but a measure. It reminded Lily why she had refused spectacle and chosen method. She opened her laptop and began to draft a response to the city. Her words were practical, modular, and careful, altogether the language of someone who believed that systems could be engineered to protect dignity. As she wrote, a notification blinked on the edge of her screen: a meeting request from a coalition of apprentices proposing a peer review board for small firms. She accepted without hesitation. Outside, the tower's glass reflected the city's movement: buses, bikes, people with umbrellas, and the work of many hands. Lily read through the coalition's proposal and made a few suggestions. The day stretched ahead, a braided sequence of meetings and small editorial choices. The landscape of change was no longer the narrow channel of a single courtroom drama. It was an expanding network of commitments, each one requiring attention and occasional correction. She closed the laptop briefly and looked at Dominic's photograph on the shelf, an image of him laughing at a rooftop event, hair wind-tussled, hand caught mid-gesture. She felt less like someone who had vanquished a single enemy and more like an engineer who had completed the preliminary drawings for a bridge that would require years of maintenance and communal tending. Her phone vibrated again, this time with a message from Marisol. "Site inspection Thursday. Can you come?" Lily typed back an affirmative and added, "Bring your gloves." She smiled at the ordinary instruction, a small, unromantic gesture of work that meant more than any speech. She stood then, walked to the window, and watched the tower catch a stray shaft of sun. In that quiet, she let the satisfaction and exhaustion exist together. There were lessons to codify, people to protect, policies to test and refine. There were also friendships to nurture and small humane acts that would have no public record. She would return to the legal fray as needed, attend council meetings, and help apprentices learn to write attribution clauses. The slow architecture of fairness required that kind of endurance. As she left the office for the site, her steps were even and purposeful. The work ahead would be protracted, the victories incremental, and the setbacks inevitable. But the scaffolding around the tower was no longer a mere construction site. It was a living testament to a different possibility, that the mechanics of production could be made to honor the people who produced. Lily moved toward that scaffolding with a practical joy that had less to do with public accolade, but with the knowledge that names, once invisible, were beginning to hold their place on the ledger of industry. She tightened the laces of her boots and set her jaw against the wind. The days ahead would demand vigilance, diplomacy, and, when necessary, the willingness to be present in rooms that preferred the comfort of denial. She was prepared for those requirements in the way she had prepared for her work, methodically, with attention to detail, and with a steady, unsensational resolve. Ahead, at the site, a new cohort of apprentices waited to be instructed. Their presence was the proof that systems could, with effort, be altered. Lily picked up her hard hat and walked into the noise of cranes and conversation, already planning the first exercise she would give them: how to trace attribution through a pile of documents and how to insist politely but firmly on acknowledgments owed. It was, she thought, a small practical lesson with a large moral consequence, and one she would teach until the lesson no longer needed repeating.